do want to thank you guys for hopping onto this live and for supporting the channel. We just hit 100 subscribers yesterday, and it really does mean a lot that we were able to do it this quickly. So thank you. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't yet, just to keep up to date, to be on different lives like this after every race, every qualifying session. Thank you guys, and let's hop into it. The Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. A Grand Prix that, in my opinion, was rather boring at parts. I mean, we've become accustomed to knowing that Max Verstappen just runs away with it within the first couple laps, and then we're just watching the midfield. Of course, in this race itself, we did have one safety car. However, that one safety car, it wasn't necessarily at the most opportune time. Up until this race, there had been a 100% probability, or every race so far has had a safety car. So we were expecting a safety car to come, or more safety cars to come. But that one safety car came right at the beginning of the race with Lance Stroll hitting the wall. And after that, it was nothing. I mean, there weren't really any strategies based on tires. There were a couple drivers that were trying to push hards on, or push mediums on a long stint, hoping for a second safety car that might somehow put him back into play, but that wasn't the case. But we'll hop into all of that. Right at the start of the race, the very first thing we have to touch on is Lando Norris jump starting the start. Now, this was noted and investigated by the stewards and the FIA, and they deemed it to be a legal start. Hence, Lando Norris did not jump the gun, he did not false start. I don't know if this was the right call. On any replay, you could see that he was moving forward. Now, you could argue that maybe he didn't move outside of his grid square, but at the same time, the sensor there is arguably what the FIA saw, and they saw the sensor didn't go off, informing that he did cross the grid line. But the rules state that you cannot move until all the lights are out, and he did move. Even George Russell, who was behind him, caught him and called him out for it. The FIA deemed it to be okay. They didn't give him a penalty, but it's something to be noted. I mean, it did happen. We'll see if he has anything to say about it after the race. It would have been probably a 5-second penalty. I don't think it would have affected his race too much. He still would have finished P8. Oh, actually, no, I think Hamilton might have actually passed him if that were the case, but he probably would have had to serve that in the pits, which would have meant that his race would have been completely different at the end, charging up on Hamilton. We'll see. At the very start of the race, we had a quick little battle between Perez and Charles Leclerc. Perez seemed as if he had gotten the better of Charles Leclerc right at the beginning into turn 1, but on the exit of turn 2, Leclerc took the outside and then did end up overtaking Perez back before going into turn 3. It was just a matter of time. We all knew it was coming. Perez did eventually end up overtaking Charles Leclerc for that P2, and he went off running alongside Max Verstappen. Ollie Bearman, in that very first lap, he was putting in work. He was racing. He was one of the only two drivers opting for softs to start the race, which showed that he wanted to come out guns blazing. He was fighting Tsunoda, and he had a couple of pretty tight calls with him, but all throughout the race, after he got his initial nerves out, I would say for the first couple, 2-3 laps, then he was just firing on all cylinders. He wasn't stopping. He was going for it. So I'm happy with his race. I'm happy for him. He had a great race overall. He finished P7 in his debut. He's the first driver to debut for Ferrari since I don't even know when, 1970 something or whatever the years. But regardless, he's the third youngest F1 driver ever. Debut with Ferrari, starting 11th, finishing 7th position, beating both Lewis Hamilton and Lando Norris directly. Wow. Ollie Bearman, we will be seeing you again, most likely. There were reports that he would even be driving for Haas this year. Looks like that might be pushed on into next year, but he deserves that seat. He deserves a seat in F1, and I think he will get it because he showed today that he can perform under pressure. Now, some teams may be skeptical to give him a seat after the previous Nick DeVries situation, but come on, you have to let him try. You have to give him that seat. Let him try. He's a great driver, a great prospect to have on your team, and I think we will be hearing his name quite often in Formula One in the future. The Alpines didn't have a great weekend. Pierre Gasly ended up retiring the car on the very first lap. He probably shouldn't have even started the race, to be honest. He was having gearbox issues on the formation lap. He made it to the grid. He started, but very first lap, they called him into the pit. It was time for him to retire that car because they weren't going to do anything with it. And unfortunately, I believe that Esteban Ocon also finished P13, so no points for him either. That Alpine, they're not where they want to be. They were projecting wins, they are projecting podiums in a couple years, and it just hasn't been the case. I don't think they're too happy with what's going on at the moment. It needs to be better. It needs to be better for Alpine. A pretty bad race overall, you could say, bad weekend for them. Same goes for Stroll. I mean, he's on the opposite end. He's in a team that is fighting for points. They do have a good team, a solid car, albeit their car may be a lot quicker during qualifying than during the actual race with the full fuel load and all that. But he shouldn't be hitting the wall on his own accord 7 laps into the race. It's not okay. Although we did get a pretty funny moment after he hit the wall and his engineer asked if he could continue the race. And he just bluntly responded that he can't continue because he is in the wall. So I thought that was pretty entertaining take from a situation that wasn't too great for Lance Stroll. Now, I don't feel too much of an affection for Lance Stroll as a driver. He is a fellow Canadian, but there isn't much that I like about him. I think he just has to be better. I thought Ollie Bearman was much better than him, and that shouldn't be the case because he has a solid car as well. He should be doing something with that car. And his direct teammate, sure, it's Fernando Alonso, and you could argue that he has a lot more experience than many others in Formula One, but you still have to be semi-competitive to your direct teammate in F1 if you want to show that you belong there and that you deserve to be in that position. After the safety car restart, there were a couple drivers, namely Hamilton and Norris, who decided not to pit and again opted into a longer stint, hoping that there would be a safety car further on in the race. The idea here was that after the safety car, we had Lando Norris starting in first, with Max Verstappen behind him, and then Lewis Hamilton in third position, with Perez, and then Leclerc, Piastri, and so forth. Now, the first couple laps after that safety car went in, Lando Norris was actually holding off Max Verstappen pretty well. I mean, you wouldn't say that there was any type of situation where he had way more pace than Lando Norris. So for a couple laps, Norris looked like he was doing okay. Of course, we all expected Max Verstappen to eventually pass Norris because there was no way that he would be able to carry on for the entirety of the race. He did have to opt in for a different compound because he couldn't finish the race on the mediums he was on. But at some point, the problem with this opting for a long stint at the beginning and hoping for a second safety car is that the second safety car actually has to come. And both him and Lewis Hamilton were really thrown off by the fact that there was no second safety car. They tried to push it for as long as possible, hoping that near the end of the race, somebody would do something. And then they opted for softs right at the end, in the idea that with the now new soft tires, they'd be able to work their way quickly up the field back into their positions before they had pitted. But that also wasn't the case because right ahead of both of them was Ollie Bearman, who didn't even have to hold them off. He was just consistently putting in solid lap times. He was 300ths behind Charles Leclerc. I can even take that in yet, how quickly he was going in such a high pressure moment with such a phenomenal driver behind him. Okay, you can argue that Norris maybe, but you have Lewis Hamilton hunting you down as well. And if that doesn't scare you and that doesn't show the nerves, nothing will. So again, he deserves this seat. I hope he gets that seat. Some more midfield action that we had. Albon squeezed by Magnussen. Magnussen had a phenomenal race, but not in the way you would think. Now, after Magnussen squeezed Albon, this was kind of a clear cut. It was obvious that Magnussen was at fault here because Albon really had nowhere to go except either go into the wall or go into the driver, and he chose for the driver because he didn't want to completely destroy his race. This ended up giving Magnussen a 10-second penalty, which may have been a little harsh, but it is what it is. And then a couple laps later, on an overtake he had on Tsunoda, I believe, a great overtake, although he overcooked it a little bit and he wasn't able to stop in time before the turn, so he did end up running off into the next turn off track. He was handed another 10-second penalty for overtaking while off track. This one I thought was very harsh because there is no way he deserved that second 10-second penalty. No way. This ended up giving him a 20-second penalty for the race, which ultimately meant his race was completely destroyed before it even had a chance. The problem was that he was in P12, and a couple of the cars ahead of him, I think besides Lewis, Hamilton, and Lando Norris, who were nowhere near him, he also had Zhou Guanyu, who had to come into the pits, and his teammate Nico Hülkenberg, who also had to pit. So what they decided to do, we still aren't sure if the engineers told him about his penalties or not, but he was defending, and he was defending with his elbows out. He was throwing punches left and right. He was making sure that no car would get by him, because he needed to create as large of a gap as possible for Nico Hülkenberg to be able to come into the pits, come out, and still be ahead, so that the Haas team could get into 10th place, meaning they would get a point, their first point of the season, and they did manage to do that. There were some feisty situations, there was some hard battling, some late lunges, anything you want, but he managed to stay there to finish in 12th. Of course, then there were a couple of penalties that had to be added on, so that wasn't his final position, but he did the job that he was there to do. He made sure that nobody would get by Nico Hülkenberg, and that Haas team is now the 6th team in Formula 1 this year to score a point, which is crazy considering I didn't even have them finishing anywhere higher than 10th this year. So congratulations to them. Their tire degradation is looking much better this year, which Nico Hülkenberg clearly showed by that very long stint, hoping as well for the strategy with a late safety car to be able to come in for a shorter stop and keeping those positions he had originally won. So great job by Magnussen. Hamilton once again made it clear that he wasn't happy in lap 17. The battle we saw between Hamilton and Piastri, it was like watching two cars of the exact same performance go up against each other. Piastri, every time on the long straight at the start-stop straight, he would try to overtake somehow. It wouldn't work. He would wind it up again. He locked up a couple times. This went on for, I think, 15, 20 laps before at some point Hamilton finally decided to jump into the pit, freeing Piastri, who did have a great race himself. He did finish P4, but there was just no overtaking for him. He couldn't get by Hamilton at all. It seemed like the DRS had no effect on the McLaren car itself, so he didn't even have a chance to go up and try to catch Charles Leclerc. I don't even know. I think he was about 16, 14 seconds behind Charles Leclerc at the end of the race. Maybe if he would have had a couple more laps, or if he would have also gotten by Hamilton right when Charles Leclerc did to be up directly behind him, he would have been more competitive, or at least battling Charles for position. But that wasn't the case. The top three drivers this race were by far the two Red Bulls, the 1-2 from Red Bull and Charles Leclerc, and they were miles ahead. So it felt like nobody was able to stop them today, and nobody was going to stop them. Perez also ended up having a 5-second penalty for an unsafe release during his pit stop under the safety car, when basically every team decided to pit at least one of their drivers, many teams opting for a double stack. And on his release, he kind of got ahead of Alonso. I mean, I think Red Bull just throws their drivers out and then look to see if somebody's actually overtaking or somebody is in that pit lane right there. Long story short, that 5-second penalty didn't really do much for Red Bull because they were still extremely dominant. It didn't affect them at all. He still finished P2 with a nice little margin to Charles Leclerc, so it didn't affect his race at all, essentially. Like I mentioned, the McLarens were very slow on a straight line, but then in the high-speed corners, they were making up for it, because at the end, after both Lando Norris and Lewis Hamilton had pitted, they were both charging to try to catch up to Bearman, to overtake him, to at least gain some positions that they had given up. And it felt like on the straights, the Mercedes were catching up to McLaren, but then in that sector one, all of those very high-speed turns, the McLarens were just pulling away, and the Mercedes had no way of keeping up. So that's one positive for the McLarens. And keep in mind, these two cars have the exact same power unit, so they're using the same engine, both Mercedes engines. There was no really differentiation between them except those high-speed corners. But before that, on the other hand, Oscar Piastri had no way of getting by the Mercedes, which pretty much made it a very boring stint for the majority of the race. We had a couple solid battles between Albon and Ocon. Nothing too great. Logan Sargent, however, was doing okay. He was pretty close to Alex Albon for the majority of the race. He did finish P15, taking out Daniel Ricciardo, Valtteri Bottas, and Zhou Guanyu, who we'll talk about a bit later. But I was pleasantly surprised with him. He wasn't the driver that actually made a mistake or caused any damage or spun on his own. He had a solid race, finished ahead of some guys. Good for him. This is a decent overall race. Although, if we look at the end results, Albon was in 11th, which is much closer to competing for points than Logan Sargent's 15th position. But I am sure he will accept that 15th place finish on such a difficult track in Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. Jeddah is killer. Jeddah is tough. Jeddah is a tough track. Alonso seemed to be racing on his own out there. I think he was enjoying himself. He finished P5 in between Oscar Piastri and George Russell. He kissed the wall at some point, which brought out some pretty cool commentary of him letting his team know that he was so close that he kissed the wall. Good race for him overall. I'm sure he's not too happy with the car's pace, given that last year he was leading the race at some point, fighting for podiums throughout this period of the season. They would like to be further ahead. It's not the case. We'll see if they do evolve and develop that car, because that was a big issue last year. They started off very strong, but then didn't bring any upgrades to the car, meaning that they didn't see much more improvements as other teams were improving alongside them. And besides that, as a team, they're just not doing great. The Ferraris are in second place behind the Red Bulls. The Aston Martins haven't been up there, and today they lost a lot of points, or definitely some points, with Lance Stroll getting out of the race so early on. There were a couple slow pit stops. McLaren had a second slow pit stop, the one when they brought in Lando Norris towards the end of the race, having to, first of all, cover off Lewis Hamilton, and then also compete for the positions ahead. It was a 4.1 second pit stop, I think. It wasn't great. It did cost them a bit. He still came out ahead of Hamilton, which would have been pretty disastrous for the situation if he had come out behind him. It ended up being okay. They didn't lose out too much on it. But like I said, that's where they finished up, so it didn't help them too much. They were forced to make that stop, but they did finish 8th and 9th in the race after those pit stops. Zhou Guanyu, another treacherous stop for that Sauber team. This stop, I don't even know, we didn't even get to see how long the stop was. Probably not as long as Valtteri Bottas' last weekend, but we have 2 weekends where we've had 2 horrible stops from that stake F1 team. They need to improve this, because there is no way, they're not even competing for points right now. Last week they were close, but this week they're nowhere near the points. And if they were near the points, imagine ruining that by your pit stop. So these variables, or these not even variables, these constants that you have, these things that you know that are going to be the same every weekend, they have to be on point, and they're nowhere near being on point. And they need to fix this going into Australia, because they can't keep making mistakes like this. These are rudimentary, basic mistakes that they are making that they can easily fix by some practice. So that's at least one thing they could work on, and one step they could take towards improving themselves, essentially. There were a couple other notions by the stewards. Norris was noted for weaving at some point, but then it turned into a black and white flag. No penalties were given out. Of course, at one point, the engineers from McLaren were trying to get a penalty for Hamilton, who would then end up losing the spot to Piastri, and all these sorts of things. But all in all, it wasn't a phenomenal race. It wasn't anything we didn't expect either. We had Max Verstappen position 1, Sergio Perez position 2. Then we had Charles Leclerc with Ferrari in P3, followed by Oscar Piastri in the McLarens, and then Fernando Alonso in the Aston Martin. Behind him we had George Russell, then we had Ollie Bearman, who I can't say without smiling today. And then, like I mentioned, Lando Norris, Lewis Hamilton, and the final point position we had Nico Hülkenberg for the Haas, scoring their first points. Another dominant 1-2 for Red Bull. A great race overall for the team. I think they mentioned in the post-race interviews, that they had cold tires towards the end. It was a bit difficult to overtake the back markers. At this point, I think they just have to come up with some stories to make it seem like they're having a hard time out there. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying what they do is in any way easy, But that car, those drivers, they're nowhere close. And a part of me would like to see Max Verstappen leave next year so we can see if Perez can win the championship with that car, or if whoever they bring in, because I'm sure they would have no short queue of people that want to come to Red Bull, would be able to perform just as well and maybe even compete for a championship. But as of now, with their two drivers, let alone the entire saga that they have going on, I do have a new video that just dropped last night on that. Make sure to check that one out because Christian Horner, in my opinion, is absolutely destroying Red Bull Racing as an organization. And if their drivers don't like it, namely Max Verstappen, I'm sure he has no problems in looking elsewhere. Charles Leclerc finishing with a P3 is a solid result for Ferrari. They've had two good weekends, and given the circumstances of Carlos Sainz this weekend, Ollie Bearman chipping in with a couple points is huge for Ferrari long term as well to secure, hopefully, that second place finish in the Constructors, because I do believe, although it's only been 2 races, this season is once again going in Red Bull's direction. So that's something we can almost bank on. Don't want to make any premature predictions, of course, but the way the season is going, that's what it looks like it's going to be. Not much else to say to this race. Wasn't a fantastic race. Again, nothing will ever live up to the first race we had here in 2021. I think that sets the bar way too high for any future race we will have here. We had a very wholesome moment after the race when Ollie Bearman got out of his car to then be congratulated by Lewis Hamilton and George Russell, welcoming him essentially to the F1, to the big boys club. It was nice to see. It'll be hard for him, I'm sure, to go back to F2, but this is some experience that's definitely going to help him long term and will be huge on his CV and his resume when he does look for another seat that does open up in F1. The next race is in 2 weeks in Melbourne, a very technical, difficult track. A great track to race. We have great racing there all the time. Last year was absolutely hectic with those restarts towards the end. It will be interesting to see how it plays out. Most likely we'll see Max Verstappen getting somewhere close to a win, because I don't want to say he's going to be winning just yet, but that's most likely the direction we will be going in. However, until then, I'm sure we will be getting a lot of off-track drama, off-track action, namely with the Red Bull drama, the saga going on right now. I will be posting another video next weekend, so make sure to subscribe if you haven't yet to catch that first thing when it drops. Until then, thank you guys. Have a great weekend, a great week. Let me know if you have any questions, and see you next time. Bye.